Good afternoon. Welcome to our last two sessions for this symposium. Our panel now is called Languages Made Visible, and we have three speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Devi, who writes in three languages, Marathi, Gujarati, and English. He has received numerous awards for his work in all three of these languages. He also initiated the People's Linguistic Survey of India in 2010, and he's also a chief editor of a 50-volume multilingual series. And in addition to all of this work and accomplishments, he has also received the Indian Civilian Honor of Padma Shri, along with other international awards such as the Lingua Pax Prize and the Prince Claus Award. Our second speaker today will be Dr. Colleen Fitzgerald. She is professor of linguistics at the University of Texas at Arlington. Her projects draw on training and focuses on Native American languages, such as a collaboration with the Chickasaw Language Revitalization Program. She is currently directing the Documenting Endangered Languages program at the National Science Foundation. Our third speaker today will be Dr. Jeffrey Heath. He's professor of linguistics at the University of Michigan. He has done many years of linguistic fieldwork from Australian Aboriginal languages in the 1970s up to, most recently, fieldwork in West Africa on the southern fringe of the Sahara. He has published extensively on vernacular Arabic dialects and Tuareg, among other languages, and he has received many research grants from NSF and NEH, as well as a Guggenheim Fellowship. So join me in welcoming these three speakers today. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I stand up to this enormous challenge of keeping you awake in a post-lunch session, let me mention that I do not know if my consciousness is a priori assumption that I've been carrying on with, or whether it is a psychobiological convenience given to me for processing the cognitive intake. And I do not know if the world outside, the phenomenal world, actually exists, or whether it is a fantasy of my consciousness. But what I know is that there is one and the only one bridge between the human consciousness and the phenomenal world, and that is language. It is the word that creates the world. And it is the word that makes humans very different from other animal species, though some of the animal species do converse. The honeybees do, the various kinds of fish do. But this complicated symbolic exchange of meaning is a peculiarly human accomplishment. And probably humans seem to have arrived at the very fag end of that great era of language. When the consciousness builds such a bridge for the phenomenological connectivity with the external world, it is a unique construction. Every language is a unique worldview. You cannot express the same thing in another language the way you express it in one language, even if there is the theoretical possibility of translation. And when a language sinks, it perishes, this unique worldview disappears. And each of these unique worldviews is the common heritage of humanity. It is not just the inheritance of the speakers of a given language, but it belongs to the entire human community. UNESCO describes the disappearance of the phenomenological bridge in very strong words by saying that disappearance of any language amounts to a silent genocide. Now, when one thinks of India, the bridges that Indians have built with the rest of the world are far too many. They are like the flyovers in Detroit, there are underpasses, there are country pathways. There have been numerous languages. I mean, to put it very simply, at the moment, out of every 90 persons in the world, 13 are Indians. It's 1.3 billion speakers, and they speak quite a lot. In fact, India is known as a talkative country. Of the 700 languages that UNESCO, UNESCO's enumeration pegs the number at 7,000. Ethnologue would say 6,000. There are debates about this, but setting aside those debates, whether it's 6,000 or 7,000 languages, more than 12% of these languages are spoken in India. In India, there are 64 scripts still alive. 85 Indian languages have broadcasting, and 35 or more have very active publication of newspapers, magazines, printing, and so on. In fact, if one were to think of the first 30 languages in the world, just sheerly in terms of the numerical strength of speakers, among those 39 are Indian languages. Now, this enormous wealth of languages has been a cultural characteristic of India all along. I shall not say for the last 70,000 years since humans started using speech as a means of communication, but I'll certainly say for the last 6,000 to 8,000 years, there has been presence of script and language, and in fact, the earliest epics in India were composed at least in 3 languages, not in 1 language. The Mahabharata, but I'll not get into that because in my remaining 20 minutes, I will be speaking at the rate of 40 languages per minute. So, Vishwanath composed a poem in the 15th century in 16 languages, single poem. Indians have been multilingual traditionally. This changed though, or at least started changing during the colonial times. Paper technology was known in India from the 12th century on, but print technology reached there towards the end of the 18th century, and at the beginning of the 19th century, it had stabilized, and only a very few languages got printed. Now, the languages that got printed were not necessarily numerically larger or philosophically richer or historically having greater longevity. This was accidentally that some got printed and others did not get printed. For instance, Maithili, which had a very long tradition, remained outside print, but Hindi, which was by then just a new language, got into print in Calcutta. When languages got into print, those who were composing those languages started composing with greater fervor for literary production, for long distance consumption. And so those languages flourished, at least flourished in the print medium. By the end of the 20th century, by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, about 11 languages were already in print. Later, in the next, during the times of the First World War, another 3 got into print. And when India became independent and the wise people in my country decided to think of what kind of constitution there would be for this country, a constituent assembly was set up, and it discussed as to which would be the languages of administration. And they came up with a list of 14 languages. This was in 1949. These were languages which had by then been printed. By then, over those 2 centuries preceding this date, all that was in writing or in print came to be seen as knowledge. All that was non-print or non-written came to be seen as folklore and non-knowledge. And so a huge amount of knowledge which was acquired in the languages was already getting trashed. But of course, 14 languages as languages of administration is quite itself a daunting order for any nation. India decided to deliberately choose the character of a multilingual nation, unlike Germany or Italy, from whom India had drawn its, and Ireland, from whom India had drawn its model of nationalism. After independence, India accepted a formula of 3 language education: language of the area, language of the state, and some kind of national language, either Hindi or English or Hindi in that order. But somewhere in the 1970s, my country entered a zone of linguistic accident. It was a suicidal accident. Let me describe what it was. We have a decadal census. It happens in the first year of every decade. In the 1961 census, the list of mother tongues, and let me please remember that every mother tongue listed in the census is not necessarily a language. It is a mother tongue label. Sometimes these are duplicate labels. Sometimes these are erroneous labels, misleading. But this is what people say are their mother tongues. 1961 census had listed 1,652 labels as mother tongues. In 1971, 10 years later, when the census took place, and the census data gets disclosed after a lot of screening is done, after a lot of processing is done, 5 or 6 years after the actual year of the census, unlike the other census data in India. When the census data appeared in 1977, I noticed, as a young researcher, that the list of mother tongues had been brought down to 108. There was one more, 109th, which read all others. That is, those 2 words contained roughly 1,545 mother tongues. And as a young man, I used to get angry in those days. I no longer get angry. I got angry. And I said, what the hell? I mean, where are these? These are mother tongues. These are sacred. These are the languages people must have worshipped. They must have inherited after thousands of years of lineage and knowledge about land, about climate, about human relations, about man-God relation, everything. So I decided to step out of my university where I used to teach, take the begging bowl in one hand and a tape recorder in another. And in those days, UNESCO was not still worried about disappearing languages. I thought I will go out and document the languages which have been concealed. Now, why did the government of India decide to conceal these languages? The reason was simple. For the government, it was a simple reason. In the early 70s, a neighboring country had got split on the language issue. Bangladesh had come into existence, and the government of India became very jittery. It felt if Indians think that they have far too many languages, there would be linguistic balkanization of the country and the integrity would be in danger. When I stepped out and started documenting the languages, I noticed that the greatest casualty was that of the indigenous communities. Of course, in India, to use the term indigenous is quite problematic, but I'll use it for the sake of easy communication here. The Adivasis, we call them tribals or Adivasis. The Adivasis in India, the tribals in India, sit in a long corridor between the Indo-Aryan languages and the Dravidic languages. And it's very difficult for me to understand as to why, despite being together for about 5,000 years, the Dravidic and Indo-Aryan did not form a single family, while the Indo-Aryan formed a single family together with European languages, Indo-Iranian languages, and so on. And I thought the tribal languages would provide some kind of answer to this great historical mystery of divided language families. I notice that the tribals were hungry for preservation of their language. I initially started with the idea of printing a magazine using the state script. And I remember when the first magazine was printed in a language called Chaudhary language in Gujarat, 700 copies were sold, and they were purchased by very poor tribals who used to, in those days, work for at $1 for 2 days kind of wages, and they paid for these copies, 700 copies, on a single day when the magazine was launched. I cried on that day, and I said, I must devote my rest of my life in conserving the languages because people want them to be conserved. So we kept on increasing the number of magazines. I realized that unless there is livelihood support, no language can remain alive. I was not a great fan of school education. In any case, other animals don't have schools, only humans have introduced this very cruel system of schools. But livelihood is very important for conservation of languages. And so we started food grain banks, we started microfinance collectives, we started all kinds of other things which would give livelihood support to the communities, and this started showing some positive results. The number of magazines increased from 1 language to 11 languages. In those days, like a fool, I used to pride in having created 11 scripts for 11 languages without knowing that scripts are purely incidental for languages. Even the English language does not have its own script till today. It is using some other script. I then decided to go to a range of 80 languages. But I could not, for a variety of other reasons, because what I was doing shaped into an institution, a tribal institution. In those years, the government of India had been contemplating carrying out a survey. The last survey of languages was carried out in India at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, by a great Irishman called George Grierson. But after independence, no such survey was carried out, and the government's plans looked like they would materialize, but somehow they fell through for reasons I'll not get into at this moment. At that stage, once again, I became angry. And I said, if the government does not do this survey, let people do it. And so I traveled from state to state to state, every district of every state in the country. And we put together teams, a team of 3,000 persons, which included linguists, writers, journalists, farmers, bus drivers, daily wages laborers, women, men, everybody and anybody who loved languages joined these teams, and they prepared the People's Linguistic Survey of India, reporting in those 50 volumes, which are in the process of being published, some 46 are published, reporting the presence of 780 languages. Now, I should feel very elated in having, been able to, report 780 living languages, in having been able to describe them linguistically, sociologically, ethnographically, and so on. In having those volumes to my credit, and whenever I visit a library, I see from a distance the signs of my sins. But I have never ceased comparing the number of languages that existed in India in 1961. Of those 1652 mother tongues, after scrutiny, one realized there were about 1100 languages. When I completed my survey in 2013, there were only 780 I could report. I must have missed on about 70, so 850. That means 250 languages had died in a matter of 50 years. And 250 languages dying in a matter of 50 years is 5 languages per year was the speed, but the speed was getting accelerated. And my guess is in the next 30 years, another 400 languages in India will perish. Now that's a very sad thought. Of course, language endangerment in India is experienced not just by minor languages or indigenous languages, but also languages which are spoken by very large numbers. I mean, you will laugh if I tell you that Hindi is spoken by about 500 million people. And all Hindi speakers complain that there is language encroachment. English is encroaching upon their linguistic domains, that Hindi speakers are no longer able to talk about pain in anesthetics in their own language. When they visit a doctor, they have to describe their pain using English language. And if they cannot use anesthetics in their language, they cannot use aesthetics in their language, because the two form a single spectrum. Beginning with a language spoken by 500 million to language spoken by just 2 persons, the panic has gripped Indian languages. I'll talk very briefly. I know you showed me 10-minute card 7 minutes ago. I have 3 minutes. I met a woman who was 85-year-old. The name of the language she spoke was Bo. She was the last speaker. She died in 2010. She died very tragically on the day which happens to be the Republic Day in India, 26 January. Towards the end of her life, she was talking to birds because there was nobody else who understood her language. There are 2 Mazi speakers in Sikkim. Both of them are dead now, but I met them 6 years back. And they were constantly worried about what would happen to the epic that they knew that their forefathers had developed in the language. A whole epic has gone down with the death of this. Beginning with 500 million to only languages spoken by 1 or 2, this panic. Now, my take on this is, I am trying to now do a language viability assessment study for all these languages. And if possible, if I have enough life, and I don't depend on governments or funding agencies for doing my research. I depend on people only. I have great faith in people, because people make languages, governments don't make them. Governments can neither create nor destroy languages. People alone can make or destroy languages. If possible, I would like to do this language viability assessment for languages of the entire world. But that is a dream, and dreams are good when they materialize. They are even better when they do not materialize. I have a feeling that there are very fundamental, great changes occurring in the structure of the human brain. Memory has been outsourced by humans to an artificial chip. Most of the languages that I've seen breaking down are first when a language breaks down, when it perishes, a beginning has to be seen somewhere. So I have seen that the past tense often is less in use. There were languages, Indian languages, with 5 forms of the past tense. But now the speakers of those languages cannot use more than 2 forms of the past tense. The past tense is diminishing linguistically. Memory is diminishing sociologically, culturally, and every state in the world is very immensely interested in attacking people's memory, suppressing people's memory. Probably the human brain is trying to think of a vision of the world which needs to accommodate many spaces, not just the earth space, and many times. I mean, once I go outside this earth, my idea of space, my idea of time, they don't really matter, though they cannot even be segregated. They will be intertwined. Perhaps humans are looking at perception through visual signals, symbolic. Perhaps the Broca's lobe, which processes sound symbols, is showing fatigue. There are far more cases of dyslexic children suffering from dyslexia. There have been good studies on this. And it is through the prefrontal cortex that the human brain wants to relate to the rest of the world. Now the question is, in the process we'll become homo deus or cyborgs or whatever term you use, where half is human intelligence, the half or more than half is artificial intelligence, a new kind of species. But the question is, when we become that, shall we sacrifice all that we have inherited over the last 70,000 years by way of linguistic symbols? And my answer is, that would be a great offense against nature. We must figure out ways of taking this forward, taking the entire inheritance of memory forward. And that is our collective challenge. The challenge is not how many indigenous languages are surviving in Brazil or India or China, or what policy United Nations comes up with. It is a far greater issue. In any case, every nation has created minor languages, minority languages. There are about 200 nations, I believe, in the world, but there are 6,000 or 7,000 languages in the world. So there cannot be, every nation has one major language. And therefore, United Nations in itself, quite ironically, is the fatal blow for human languages. We should have United Languages of the World Forum in order to keep languages going. Thank you very much. There are 2 minutes left. Oh, she's now shown stop, so I'll stop. I think we will have to overcome our shyness in protecting languages. Sitting here since the morning, I was thinking, if Michigan allows writing of PhD in Tamil or in Swahili or in some other language, if it does not, then those who belong to this university must start a campaign. Respecting every language is a sure way of being civilized. Undermining any language is a sure way of being brutal to all the inheritance of humanity. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Devi. Our next speaker is Colleen Fitzgerald. The title of her talk is The Restorative Role of Indigenous Language Vitality.
I have a lot of Google alerts on things, and one of the Google alerts that I have is on Indigenous languages, and today there was a CLOSA dissertation mentioned in one of my Google alerts. So people are doing this, people are able to achieve this. And I think that's a great segue into my talk, which I hope will convey, oh good, I was looking for the timer. I hope will convey the reason why language revitalization goes on, because people are enjoying it. It's hard work, but there's much hope in it. I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, on whose traditional territory the University of Michigan lands reside. And I'd also like to commend the University of Michigan, which has Ojibwe language classes in its curricular offerings. So this slide is the gloom and doom we've been hearing about at various points today. It's done as a pie chart, so we're able to really visually see how the green languages are the ones that have the strongest vitality in terms of the numbers of speakers and the levels in which the language is used, and those are looking pretty good. As the colors resemble a stoplight into black, what we see is less and less vitality in this pie chart. What I'm going to do today is talk about a language in the black zone, which is, I don't use that E word, I say sleeping language. So a sleeping language in the black zone, and also a red zone language, so a language that's critically endangered. So two languages that are in the scariest zone you can be in this pie chart. You know, we've been hearing about this overwhelming number of people in the world who speak really 35 languages. So 75% of the people speaking 35 languages. These numbers have been, put in different proportions. I did this as a word cloud to give you a sense by population. So the bigger the name of the language, the more speakers it has comparatively. But I want to change the narrative today here with you. And I want to change that narrative into something that language is doing and its role as connections that are a community. And this particular picture is a picture from the Oklahoma Breath of Life workshop in 2010. And this particular picture reflects an exercise that Darryl Baldwin, who I understand is coming soon to University of Michigan, I encourage you to go hear him, had participants do. And so the Breath of Life workshop is for sleeping languages, languages for which there are no living first language speakers remaining. And coming into language revitalization with that as your language situation creates a lot of challenges. And so Darryl started off the Oklahoma Breath of Life workshop by having participants use this ball of twine to think about all the things that a community shares: food, games, language, all kinds of things, stories, relatives. So that's how we can conceptualize language, the role it plays in communities where revitalization is vibrant. And language is really restoring the energy that was there before conquest, before colonialism. It's restoring hope, it's restoring relationships and strengthening relationships, it's strengthening identity, and it's restoring sovereignty. And so I'm going to try and show you that today with some stories of people who are doing this kind of work. And I'm going to start with one elder's pathway to hope, and that elder is the late Jerry Imitachi. Jerry was a Chickasaw elder, a fluent speaker, an amazing guy. Let me tell you about Jerry. When I first met Jerry, it was in 2010, which is my first visit up to Chickasaw Nation, and it was at the Language Committee meeting. And the Language Committee meeting was pretty cool. One of the things that the Language Committee does, it's got fluent speakers on it, and they do new word formation. So what are the words in Chickasaw that we need to use to describe everyday things? And I think that particular night, octopus was one of the words. I can't remember what it actually ended up being, but I'm sitting at this table with Jerry, and he's, people would say it's me and a number of elders, and people would start arguing in English, and they'd argue in Chickasaw, and there were several times people would say things in English, and Jerry kind of muttered, Chickasaw, Chickasha, Chickasha, say it in Chickasaw. And, Jerry had health issues. He was, in the last years of his life, I think he was doing dialysis 3 days a week. Weekdays a week, which is, and then on the mornings of 2 of those days, he would come to the language program, and he would sit with the language program staff who were intermediate language learners, and he would spend his mornings with them. What I learned at Jerry's funeral was the vigor with which he was pursuing his language work and dedicated to his tribe and to his language was the same kind of dedication he had in many of his activities. And, the man was pastoring, he was teaching language classes. I mean, the church was packed. And one of the people, there were several eulogies. So this tells you what kind of role this guy played in his community. And one of the eulogies said, I don't know, Jerry, the young people, why are the young people drawn to Jerry? And someone was like, Jerry's just cool. He was just a cool guy. And so that's Jerry. Well, here's a picture of us. I think this may be the last time that I saw him, because on subsequent visits he wasn't around. He wasn't well enough, or he was at dialysis. So this is us hunched over a computer, working on a recording of Chickasaw, working on the transcription, working on the translation, and hanging out and just doing language work. And in the background, you could see standing up is Teresa Workman, who is like the heart and soul of making sure the language program operates and the trains are running on time. Further, right in front of her is an elder, Rose Jefferson, who is just, again, an amazing leader in her community. I've got one of my undergrads there. You can't quite see Josh Hinson. He's the director of the language program. But, you see this picture and you think, wow, this guy is really in it. He's been in it all along. He's spending the last years of his life in it and committed to his language. Before I continue that story, let me just make sure everyone knows about Chickasaw. So Chickasaw is a Native American language, and if we were going to use number of speakers to indicate vitality, 50 fluent speakers is the number that's officially used. None of them are under the age of 60. It was originally a Southeast Aboriginal language, and in 1830, the Indian Removal Act forced people to move to what was then Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. And now most of the Chickasaw speakers that remain are in Oklahoma. There's one in California and one in Tennessee. So Jerry's language journey was not where you might think it was with those initial slides and the stories that I told you. And I can tell you this in part because of a work by Chickasaw scholar Carrie Chu, her dissertation, 2016 dissertation at the University of Arizona, does an ethnography of revitalization, looking at 3 generations of people involved in Chickasaw language work. And Jerry is one of the people she interviewed. And so she notes that, and so I've got several quotes that are all coming from her dissertation. And I think it's available on the Arizona dissertation repository, so you can download it and check it out. So his father would only speak English to him in order to ensure success in a white man's world. And when Jerry had children of his own, he believed the same, that his children couldn't advance unless they had the English language down. So that doesn't seem at all like the guy I was telling you about. The guy who is coming in between dialysis to sit and work with these 30-somethings who were also learning their language. Well, what Chu argues in her dissertation is that Chickashanumpa language reclamation is grounded in hope and optimism. And I think you really see through Jerry that arc of hope. So in another interview, Jerry says, when this language thing began to be told about in the Indian communities and they began to hear the language, they began to want to learn. And I told them, which is wrong, and that's Jerry saying in retrospect. Now I'm telling you today, this is what I told them, and it was wrong. If I teach you who you're going to speak to, there's nobody else in the family that speaks it fluently, and I'm not going to live forever. So the utility was only insofar as there were conversational partners. So again, not the guy you would have thought was hunched over a computer with me. But his journey of hope really had turned full circle by getting involved in the language. So people called upon him, they called upon him, and finally when he was called, he answered that call. If I weren't here anymore, he's going to carry the language on. These young men, they'll be the ones to carry it on, I think, because they're really interested. And so he's talking about those people on the language program staff. At the time, they were guys, but there's some women working there in that department doing that kind of work now. And in fact, the staff that were that level, the beginner learner level, are now involved in other activities, and you've got a new generation of beginning learners who are doing the same kind of thing, but with different speakers. In this picture, you have Josh Hinson, who's the director of the Chickasaw Language Revitalization Program, in the foreground. This was at a language workshop in Oklahoma. And you've got in the background 2 of the guys he's talking about. He's talking about Josh, but he's also really talking about more than Josh, that there was a cohort. And that cohort, right in that back picture, that's Brandon White Eagle and Rick Greenwood. And Jerry muses, it's just the beginnings of a language program. There's a lot more to be had. So he's really embraced it and seen where it can go, and sees where it can go even though it's not there yet. And one of the amazing things about language revitalization in this program, and I think in many programs, many communities, because it's not always a formal community, formal program, is that it restores those intergenerational relationships between fluent speakers and second language learners. This is Jason, who's now working in the language program staff, and he's not Jerry's son or grandson, but he's there to learn the language. So those family ties where the opportunity with the kids in the home was there to pass the language on, you know, that Jerry wasn't ready for the call at that point. But later in his life, he took that on and took that mantle, and those language relationships grew for this wider network. And in fact, when you look at what the attitudes are in Chickasaw Nation about what is a healthy family, what is a healthy nation, we actually can look at that. There's a dissertation on this topic. There is also a study that came out at the same time roughly at the same time this picture was taken. And that study they did a lot of surveys with Chickasaw community members to get a sense of what did they think, what were their attitudes about a lot of things. And there were questions related to historical trauma. And you know, one of the very salient factors for people was even if it was 3 generations removed, you would have grandchildren talking about their grandparents' experience in the boarding schools, having their language taken from them. So that trauma and those stories were very, very present for Chickasaw Nation members. One of the things that someone said in response is a strong Chickasaw family would include lost traditions, ceremonies, and activities being restored, so restoration, and Chickasaw language being prevalent. So there is this real sense that Chickasaw identity, Chickasaw family, Chickasaw nationhood involves restoration of language and culture. And this particular picture I took at a language family immersion camp that was held up near Stroud, Oklahoma. I got lost getting there. GPS doesn't work in many parts of rural Oklahoma. And I'm not good with directions on a good day, so. But what you have here, it's family immersion camp. And people came in with lots of different levels of language. And there was, you know, let's learn the family relations. Let's learn the words we use to talk about our kin. And let's do the traditional games. And so you had people playing stickball, which is a traditional game for the 5 tribes. The food I'm picturing is it's neo-traditional now, but you know, it's biscuits and scrambled eggs. But they're labeled with pictures and the English and Chickasaw. So people are being surrounded by language. They're being met where they're at, regardless of how much language they have. They've got resources there. And you also have this, I mentioned the Chickasaw Language Committee, and you have this really, again, I mean, just the first time I was at Language Committee, it just has been such an educational experience for me. People vigorously debate the authenticity of how Chickasaw works, often in their language. And so there is a very deep sense of how Chickasaw is an action-oriented language. It is verbal. And it is just, so there is a very strong sense, and people will debate different ways you might say thermometer, and converge on one, usually with agreement, but not always, converge on one that expresses itself in a way that is authentically Chickasaw. This is an amazing group of people. This was in 2011. This is January 2011. They had decided the language committee members had decided they wanted to do a quilt with every member on the committee having a square and, you know, representing that membership. And this is a square from Rose Jefferson when that little documentation picture I had and Rose was in the background. That was Rose. So you can see the languages on the quilt, people's names are on the quilt. Chikasha Nompa, it's everywhere. And I'm sort of just a side, you know, bystander. We go up and we document, and we are able to have these group events. People come because it's fun, because people really do enjoy using the language. They use it when, they're sitting around, there's either the coffee table, so people hang out at the elders hang out at the coffee table and they're drinking coffee, and they just start talking Chickasaw. So we're able to have successful documentation activities because we're, again, meeting people where they're at, which is, we can do some verbal elicitation. We can sit down and do some things that are paradigms more boring. But what people come for is being able to share their stories. And so that's a lot of what we do. And then we work through those stories to get translations and sometimes transcriptions. So a lot of activity. I just would say a lot of joy, a lot of happiness around language, and a lot of levels of usage of the language. So I pulled a quote from Trish Rosborough's University of British Columbia dissertation. If you're interested, there's a lot of really great Indigenous scholarship around language work being produced at University of British Columbia and also University of Victoria, which has several masters. They have a master's and a certificate in Indigenous language revitalization, and students do these master projects. And these are people who are grassroots practitioners and come and get the theory and integrate it in really inspiring ways. But Trish is a PhD who's now on the faculty at UVic. I want to be clear that as a Kwakwaka'wakw person working to recover Kwakwala for myself and my community, two of the issues that I have identified are of greatest concern to my work: the relation between identity and language, and the decolonizing potential of learning my language are the driving forces behind my research and my journey to speak Kwakwala. In short, I need no reason to do this work other than the belief that our language is who we are. And I know that's familiar to other people in the room. So there is a lot of identity wrapped up in language revitalization. So I'm going to tell you another story about another gentleman. This piece of paper had a word list, and it was from his grandfather. It had words that were not in English, and probably nouns. And this was all this man had or knew about his heritage language. It hadn't been spoken in a couple of generations. But this piece of paper, this item from that relative, led this man to try to find more on his language. Led him to earn a master's in linguistics to try and figure out his language. His language is Miami, which is a relative of Ojibwe, and it has a lot of hard things to learn. It acts very, very differently from English, and so he did this, and he's learning his language, and that journey started from nouns, and it ended up moving into a situation where he's brought it into the home, where his wife, who is not a tribal member, and him agree to use the language for their children as best they can. They actually had two batches of children, the older children and the younger children. And three of those kids are pictured here. So this is the Baldwin family. This is Darryl and Karen Baldwin, and Darryl Baldwin was that man. So how do you go from a piece of paper to that kind of restoration in the family? I mean, that's faith in something that you think is going to happen. And what's so interesting is that it started in the family, but it became much more than the family. And so what you start to see in the Miami Nation today is how culture, language, history, environmental knowledge, all of that is being reclaimed, revitalized, and used to make the educational system and opportunities to young Miami kids, youth, reflect the Miami worldview. And this is an example from that 2012 Oklahoma Breath of Life, with one of the Baldwin kids and a student from Miami University who's also a tribal member. And they had to do language projects, and Maya, I think it was Maya, she chose to do ribbon work. And part of why she chose to do ribbon work is because it's women's activities, and women's activities aren't always represented in language revitalization and language documentation. And so that's what she wanted to do, and there's actually been, since then, a number of really amazing cultural reclamation projects coming from Miami ribbon work. And Miami University and Miami Tribe of Oklahoma have a partnership. The university at some point reached out. They developed this. First it was a Miami project. Now it's the Miami Center. And Darryl Baldwin is the director of that center. And you might have heard of him. He's just recently won a MacArthur Award for his genius in these language activities. And one of the things that they've done is they've taken these small cohorts of students that come to Miami University from the tribe, and they have a chunk of their classes. They have a bit of a curriculum that's got to reflect Miami worldview, culture, language, history. They have a cultural requirement. And they've actually been doing some educational studies on these students to get a sense of, is there an impact? And so this is a quote from Mosley and Howard et al., an article that came out in 2016. Consistent with numerous retention models, these Miami students who experienced the Miami courses, as opposed to students who did not have that opportunity, were retained and ultimately graduated at higher levels. It's a small cohort, but it's encouraging to see that graduation rates, which are the lowest for Native Americans than compared to other minority groups, are, in this context, they're seeing positive work. If you look at the level of the Miami Nation, I mean, this is just a screenshot from their website, the tribal website. Miami language is everywhere. It's all over this. So it's clear that what happened in a family, what really happened from a relative's legacy, went into the family and spread outward into the nation. Nila Miamia, I am Miami. So this strong sense of identity, having this great impact for these young people's lives, for the nation, reinforcing identity. So really amazing things coming out of that community. One of the things I've argued is that language revitalization must be considered as a factor when you're evaluating language vitality. These are two languages, the red zone and the black zone. They're not languages we would consider to be very vital if we think about that pie chart. And yet I believe I've shown, how incredibly vibrant and vital language revitalization is in these communities. And that it's more than that. It's not just a lot of activity, a lot of vibrant energy. It's restorative. It's really playing an important, impactful role in those communities. Oops. So in May, at the end of May, I was at the Muckleshoot Casino up in the Washington State, and I was doing some outreach for at the the State of Washington Early Language Learning Summit, and so it's all Native educators who are teaching little kids and babies, and so a lot of great people doing hard work in the trenches with kids. And so one of the speakers asked everyone to turn to the people at your table and explain what does language mean to you? And so one of the young ladies at my table, who's a language teacher, said, well, what does our language mean to me? Sovereignty, self-determination. So I think if we think about the themes, the narrative that I hope has come through in the language revitalization work that I've shown you today, these men and women's stories. We start with hope. People do this work because there's hope, there's joy, they believe it's going to make a difference. Relationships. Relationships make things really nice. When you have good relationships with people, you're happy to come to work, you're happy to do things, you're happy to see people. So relationships, also very restorative. If we think about that Trail of Tears, the Indian removal, not everyone made it. Not all the grandparents made it. Not all the babies made it. So this is restoring those relationships that were so fractured in removal. Identity. I think we've seen the strong role of identity that Indigenous language revitalization offers. And finally, sovereignty. So, Chokmashki, Yakoke, Miigwech.
Okay, good. Well, I'm going to I'm talking about the Middle East, which is a very different place than the Americas and the type of Okay, so I guess I have to click over here. Okay. I'm going to talk about the Middle East. I'm actually representing the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies today, so I'm not going to talk about other parts of the world where I have worked. So these are where the people are. This happens to me in classrooms also. So along the coast in the Mediterranean, the Nile Valley, and then a more dense population in Turkey and Iran. Now, this is a tough neighborhood, and we're reminded of this all the time. This is just a typical days and news reports, mostly from hotspots, mostly about violence, military actions, attacks, what have you. It's a tough area, and even the countries that are not hotspots at the moment are countries with a lot of conflict going on under the surface. Group allegiance in this area is mostly based on, probably primarily based on religious affiliation.
It's very distracting. There. Very sorry about this.
I mean, the going up off and on isn't a major problem.
It's kind of hurting people's eyes.
Okay. There are, of course, the major. I know I can't even see this. Okay, there are the three major revealed religions, each of which has many sects and a lot of divisiveness among them. Various minority religions and so forth. Nation ethnicity, of course, is also very big, especially when your country's soccer team is playing a neighboring country's team, and then languages come in. They're not as quite as important as they are in other parts of the world in terms of group identity, but they do get tangled up with the other things. Now, in the Middle East, and which I'm defining as basically from Morocco to Iran, MENA, M-E-N-A, I would say there are four major national, international languages, all of which have an enormous amount of religious and historical baggage that has to be taken into consideration when one looks at the treatment of smaller population languages. There are two really significant transborder languages, if that's the word. Then there are the heritage languages, which I'll talk about to some degree, and then small population resident languages. Okay, Arabic is the huge language in the area. It's the language of God in the Quran, so it has a status unlike any other subordinate language. There's in addition to the Quran itself, there's a vast classical Arabic literature and a mostly last couple of centuries modern literature. Which creates a kind of cover over all of these assorted so-called dialects that are spoken all over, which this gives you a rough division, which are generally not mutually intelligible. So linguists would group them into multiple languages, and I'll come back to the Arabic dialects at the end. Until recently, the use of the dialects was discouraged in those zones where the government really had control, really cared about, which is mostly schooling and media, most media, including news reports. But in other contexts, the dialects are under the radar. They're not particularly oppressed. in most cases. So in a sense, the existence of literary Arabic over that whole area provides a certain amount of cover for the spoken varieties to evolve on their own. Hebrew, of course, revived as a spoken language going back to the 19th century. There's an interesting argument about its name and therefore its identity going on right now among intellectuals, including linguists. This is a book by Gilad Zuckerman, who is determined to change the name from Hebrew or modern Hebrew to Israeli and give it a unique modern identity with a lot of input from other Jewish languages. The third of the four major languages, Turkish, which itself has a very interesting history in terms of it's being reshaped and rebranded after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was completely demolished, and they were actually lucky to have come out with a country called Turkey, because even that was imperiled for a while. So out went Ottoman Turkish, written in Arabic script, with lots of Arabic and Persian words. In comes New Turkish in Latin script, with lots of European loanwords. And some of them were sold to the people as the repatriation of words in French or English that, of course, originated as Turkish and had gone astray for a while and were coming back to the homeland. And then the fourth is well, in Iran, where Farsi or Persian is dominant, there are many other languages. Some of them are closely related to Farsi, so it's not quite as divided. But then there are the let's see, down here, I guess the colors are different on my computer. There are some Arabic-speaking areas which are of geopolitical interest right now, and Baluchistan over there. Now, the first of the two trans-border languages is Kurdish, and of course this is of geopolitical significance, and we can't really talk about language without getting into the politics and the ethnicity. So you can see they form something of a geographic block going through 5 countries. So the ultimate trans-border language and ethnicity. Now, the languages, linguists would say there are approximately three Kurdish languages, of which the northern one is the most popular, has the largest number of speakers, and it has been recognized as an official language in Turkey, somewhat grudgingly, as an official language in Turkey since 2002. But the down here is the, in the south, is the language with more of a tradition as a written language and an official language going back to the British administration in Iraq and continuing now. So it's one of these complicated issues in terms of how to unify Kurdish, which you'd want to do if you had a Kurdish state suddenly materialized, taking up a large part of these areas, which of course is the dream of the Kurdish militia movements. There is a Kurdish Academy of Language, and they are cautiously advocating ultimate unification of the language, but they understand, they're not stupid, they understand how difficult that would be even just linguistically because of the sharp division, especially between North and South Kurdish, which have different grammatical systems and so forth. But their idea is to develop the languages, develop the vocabulary, to unify the orthography. Again, the orthography being very important symbolically. And then hopefully, gradually, they converge, or things happen on the ground instead of being imposed by the academy. The second one of a somewhat similar nature is Berber, which is a language family that linguists divide into many different languages. And you can see from a glance at the map that they occur in multiple countries. There's actually the largest populations are in Algeria and Morocco. The big blue blotch is the Tuaregs, which is actually not as large a population as the map makes it look, and they're actually located mostly in 3 or 4 mountain ranges. So there isn't any possibility of Berber political union. No one is really talking about that, but there is an interest in cultural and linguistic unification. Now, in Morocco, there's a long history of, I don't want to go a lot into history, but there was a time during the French colonial period, early 20th century, when actually Berber identity was encouraged by the French colonial leaders. Some would argue that it was in order to, it was divide and conquer, drive a wedge between the Arabs and Berbers. So partly for that reason, the Berber languages are very much out of favor during the post-colonial period, especially when Arabization was at a high point. The desire for Arabization was at a high point in the 1980s when I spent a lot of time in Morocco, when the idea was to shift from French to literary Arabic as the language of schooling. And of course, Berber didn't really fit into that at all. Now, there's been a resurgence of of general Berber interests and of Moroccan Berber interests. There have been the things that make the news are political riots that are sort of political and economic. But what doesn't get reported is that there's a linguistic element in the backstory. And Berber language rights is part of that overall movement, but tends to be Morocco-specific. There are people who want to unify Berber languages. It's like taking all the Germanic languages or all the Romance languages or what have you and unifying them. It's very difficult to do technically. They do have one nice thing, which is a script. There's a traditional Berber orthography called Tifinagh, which is, I can't reach it over there. I guess it looks almost like Egyptian hieroglyphs to the uninitiated. However, Morocco and Algeria famously don't get along. The border has been almost virtually closed for at least since the 1980s, and so there's really no realistic way of any significant unification, linguistic or otherwise. All right, small population resonant languages, which are what many people would think of as indigenous languages. I'll give you one example. This is the colors show the Songhai language family, which is mostly down along the Niger River in Mali and into Niger and so forth. The green areas are northern Songhai languages, which have become Berberized, but they're not too far away. And then way up at the top, you see the oasis of Tabel Bala. And there's another Songhai language that somehow ended up there. It had something to do with the trans-Saharan caravan trade a long time ago, and with slavery and so forth. So the history of it is, but it's way outside of the normal area for this otherwise sub-Saharan language family. The Koranje language, this would be your target if you were going to do a study of an endangered language or started a revitalization project like the ones that Colleen has been involved in. However, the linguist who's been there lately indicates that there just isn't any real interest in the language locally, and it's not much used by children. And this, since it doesn't tie in with religion or other factors, this seems to be the pattern in a good part of the Middle East. Now, heritage languages are very interesting, coming from the middle MENA and into MENA. So I'm going to talk briefly about the Euro-American diaspora and then later about Israel. Now, what happens in heritage communities, whether it's one family or a neighborhood in a city, is that you get very rapid pattern of change in language use. If they all came at the same time, then you have the first old generation, the first generation, the second generation, which tends to keep the language at arm's length as it assimilates, and then the third generation return, the nostalgic wish to return to the language and culture of the grandparents. And then in Israel, where you've had immigration from within MENA, Middle East, North Africa, and from other. And it's a little different in Israel because of the special status of vernaculars that are considered to be Jewish, that are related to the religion. So in the Euro-American diaspora, the example would be Neo-Aramaic languages. It's a bunch of small population languages from the kind of dangerous areas in the Middle East, roughly the same areas that the Kurds live in, so Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and so forth. Now, most of them have emigrated, and in fact, one of the largest populations of any Neo-Aramaic language are the Chaldeans, the so-called Chaldean community in the Detroit area, including Detroit City. And this raises the kind of philosophical question, what do we mean, what does UNESCO mean by indigenous language? If basically 3/4 of the population moves to another location, are they disqualified from being indigenous by virtue of having moved? The same might be said of the same question might be asked of the Chickasaw, incidentally. Now, the Chaldeans have a pretty active there are a lot of them in the Detroit area. They're well organized. They get together. They have cultural events, and there are language courses. I don't think I have time to show to open the link, but this is a graduating class from one of their programs. So that's a relative success story in terms of ethnic languages. But again, does that count as an indigenous language? Interesting question with significant consequences. Now, in Israel, the heritage language, of course, the 800-pound gorilla is Yiddish, which was the spoken language by the Eastern European Jews who dominated Israel in the early days, and actually have still used, I believe, in some of the Hasidic communities in New York City and nearby. So Yiddish is the classic example of the language that makes the transition from being a vernacular that lots of people use to transition over a few generations to become a language that except perhaps in the Hasidic communities, a few pockets where it's still a vernacular. But other than that, it makes a transition into a language that is studied and revered, and so of course it has a literature, including a secular literature, novels, and so forth. So it's something that can be studied, and Never Say Die was the collection of one of the anthologies about the status of Yiddish. So it's one of the best studied areas, best studied languages in terms of this arc from one to another, and it's done so very relatively successfully. Here, incidentally, I can't resist showing it. Of course, the newspaper, the old Yiddish newspaper, the Vorwärts, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in America, the Yiddish at one point had to make a very painful transition from being primarily published in Yiddish with Hebrew characters to being published in English, because as the readership aged, and amusingly, the letters morph from Hebrew letters into English, but of course it's backwards, ironically enough, so that the F is in the Yiddish is the one on the far right, and that ends up being the D, and so forth. So just an amusing little anecdote, but a symbol of the gradual transition or morphing from, in this case, from one language to another, but more generally from one status to another. Now, I'm not an expert in what's going on in the MENA, the Middle East North African heritage languages in Israel. There are quite a few of them. I'm familiar with the Judeo-Moroccan Arabic community there. I spent some time with them in the 1980s. There are quite a few of these languages. They've come in at different times. So the Ethiopians, perhaps one of the last groups, of course, they're all going through the usual process of assimilation and declining in vitality as vernacular languages. But they have a special status as Jewish languages, and that counts for something in Israel, particularly because there are religious texts that are important for them. For example, in the Moroccan Arabic case, the Moroccan Judeo-Arabic case, there's a tradition of recitation of the Torah in alternate lines in Hebrew or Aramaic, as the case may be, in traditional Sephardic pronunciation, so different from the Ashkenazi pronunciation, followed by a line which translates it in a somewhat archaic and somewhat poetic form of Moroccan Judeo-Arabic. And these documents of this type, even if they were orally transmitted in the homeland, they are written down. And they become somewhat sacred texts in which the vernacular language is sacralized, so to speak, by being part of this, or a variety, a register of that. And I think the importance of that should not be underestimated. And partly because of this, and there are other, of course, religious texts. There are texts, oral texts that were written down that are associated with various Jewish holidays and so forth. And partly because of this, there's quite a bit of academic research on these languages, which wouldn't be the case for other heritage languages that come in from Europe or other places that are not distinctively Jewish and don't have come with these accoutrements. Also, Moroccan Jews, miraculously, in last couple of decades, they are able to go back to Morocco. And a lot of people who grew up in Morocco and are my age or older, since the immigration was mostly around 1951, the last couple of decades, they've been able to go back to their original villages and so forth, and sometimes bring their children who were born and raised in Israel. So it's an interesting situation there. It's a little bit different. Now, since Jews supposedly come from the Holy Land and ended up in Morocco or wherever, when they do aliyah or immigration to Israel, are they being repatriated to their original homeland, or are they immigrants in the fashion of North American heritage languages? Another interesting philosophical question for the UNESCO to deal with. Okay, back to Arabic. Now, Arabic is the huge language all over this area, almost defines the Middle East and North Africa. Moroccan Arabic is a collection of spoken dialects, because there were different periods of immigration from the 8th century, and then later the 13th century, from different parts of the Arab world. So it's a very complex, but it's becoming more uniform. It's becoming koine, as the dialects that were the inputs combine in this rather small country, and one that is closed off because the borders with neighboring Algeria are closed, and there's no Arabs to the north any longer. So an interesting koine has been developing. Moroccan Arabic, spoken Moroccan Arabic, was formerly prohibited, at least theoretically, in schools and most media. Although, of course, in practice, the teachers had to use it. And at the time when French and Arabic were competing, when it was the Arabization process, taking away from France, and I got it, and the spoken dialect was not a priority. If anything, it was the exception was radio broadcasts of soccer matches, which were done in dialect but purified of French loanwords, which everyone used on the streets. All right, now, I was back there recently, and now they're encouraging teachers to use the spoken language in schools. The dialect is officially recognized. There are faculty positions at the universities on the dialects and so forth. It's because of the Koineization, it's becoming a kind of symbol of national unity. And lo and behold, now there are several cable stations which do round-the-clock Moroccan Arabic shows, including dramas and sitcoms. And there's also a Berber. To my amazement, there's also a Berber television channel. Okay, Maltese is don't have time for this. It's the Arabic variety that escaped the influence of the classical language as a Christian language in Malta. Your takeaways: tough neighborhood, demographic disruptions that make it difficult to classify things as indigenous or not. Language is generally trumped by religion and nationality in the core MENA countries, although they get tangled up. And in heritage communities, language becomes more central when you have a stretch of generations and a lot of linguistic dynamics that are very obvious to the members of the families. And so you have a lot of hopeful signs, a lot of inspiring things that happen locally, especially in the diaspora, and I think in Israel, and a lot of doom and gloom elsewhere. Thank you. And remember, God speaks Arabic or Hebrew, depending on what day of the week, and never say die.
So I'm going to start us off with some questions that were sent to us on behalf of the UN Secretariat. Maybe I will... In some ways, we could ask a broad general questions of all of the speakers, but I think I might do the piecemeal approach. So I will start with Dr. Devi. And one of the questions that was posed is about the technologies, right, that are available for doing work with indigenous languages. So given some of the script development and the books and texts and the field work, what are some examples of language technologies successfully fostering dissemination and protection of indigenous language?
Community radio, mobile telephone.
Yeah. And are you finding that indigenous communities are welcoming of these kinds of technologies?
Who does not like their language to be alive?
So for a counterexample, right, so there are a bunch of Indian tribes in the Southwest who are currently torn because those in authority of the language programs believe that the languages should not be written down. And not only should they not be written down, they should not be public, right? They should remain within sort of the tribal control, literally sort of and figuratively. How might you address situations like that where there are these tensions? Do you have any thoughts?
I don't know what the government perspective would be.
Yeah.
I have very simple interest that every language should be preserved as much as possible, as far as possible. When tribals speak, they are seen as anti-nationals.
Mm.
Anything they say related to their land, their identity, their religion, which is different from standard religions, their language, that is seen as challenge to the state. But that is the state's business. As far as I am concerned, tribals have right to voice their concerns, and they must.
Absolutely. All right, moving on. Yes, Jeff.
On the technology side, I didn't have time to talk about Moroccan Arabic, which in the era of social media is now being used in Latin script, which the technology requires, using letters cleverly for consonants that aren't represented in the. And this has led to a huge increase in Moroccan Arabic literacy. And again, it's a way of going under the radar of the official literary language, which is still in the newspapers and everything else. There's none of this would appear in printed writing. So it's an amazing phenomenon. Everybody's doing it now.
I'd chime in that social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and people have mentioned WhatsApp in the morning sessions.
Grouping.
Yeah, I mean, so Facebook, you know, you've got Inupiaq in Facebook now, and so you can use, your whole interface is in that language, not in English. Same thing with Cherokee in Facebook, so you can have your, so any of you could go in if you're on Facebook and pick the language that is everything is seen in. The Cherokee have actually had a great partnership with, I think, both Microsoft and Google. So Microsoft Office suites are also have been set up. They did a localization project with Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma to have the entire menu of, you're opening a Word document, but the word that you've picked to open is written in the syllabary, and it's a Cherokee word. And they have a team of translators who have worked to create the appropriate vocabulary to do these actions in the language. Cherokee is a language known for having handling verbs, which means when you pick up an object, what the shape and content of the object is, it determines the way the verb looks. So picking up a rope-like object is very different from a glass of water, and the verb reflects that.
Can I add something? We have all over the world a lot more communication technology, but we have all over the world much less communication. And having technology probably might be related to having less of communication. When I see young children now standing in front of each other and texting to each other rather than speaking. So languages which have lived in oral traditions, they have defined the character of life of those people. And the moment you take away that orality, the definition changes. You force them into lexicality, they become different. They become some other pale shadow or imitation of somebody else. So international institutions have great enthusiasm for language technology. But if language technology is in the interest of language, then use of technology with an element of caution might be a good idea. Yes.
What about technology as a function of community? So I think you're making a great point about your technology isn't going to save your language. But what technology can do for your language is create a community, create stakeholders who feel pride and ownership in the language. So it can be a vehicle for other kinds of...
Well, I mean, this is sociologically complex. I think a community has a certain technological attainment. Its environment is technologically of a certain level. And if the indigenous community somewhere in Africa, somewhere in Asia, somewhere in South America, does not have sociologically arrived at that level of technology. See, I mean, I remember, I'll give you a rather eerie example. In India, we were taught English by the British Conceal. And Indians use English in a certain way, but the British Conceal tutoring of English was of a different, it became comic. What I'm trying to say is, if a certain community has not seen a wall clock and suddenly you putting them on Twitter, then there could be a great schizophrenia in the community. it will have, the use of technology will have to be at par with exposure to technology that that community has, and it will have to be in the interest of language communication. So, languages cannot be made subservient to language technology. Technology will have to serve the purpose of language. That is all that I am saying. I am not against technology as such. I do use myself telephone and mobile and internet, and but voice is language, and a lot of technology is silencing voice. It is reducing language to its shadow. So, shadow cannot become language. That is.
So I have one more, well, actually, I'll compress the question. But one of the things that the language teachers that I work with regularly, right, is all of this technology that the schools are encouraged to buy, as opposed to developing a curriculum that actually facilitates learning the language, learning to speak the language. And they remind everyone all the time, right, that it's an oral language, and those are the traditions, and that's knowledge that we need to preserve. And yet, some of the technology that they now have in the classroom allows them to video conference, right, with elders who aren't able to get there to work with them, right? And it allows them to video conference with students at UBC who are working on the language. And so there are these opportunities, right? So the next question we have for all of you is, given not just the technology, but these techniques, what other kinds of techniques, regardless of technologies, are there that can help revitalize or promote the vitality of these indigenous languages? So like we saw Darryl Baldwin's exercises.
So Barb, I think your video conference example gives us a sense of what actually could make a methodology useful. And I think it's starting for a community to start where they're at, and to just, where are we at? What are our resources? Do we have speakers? Do we have technology? Do we have internet everywhere? Because obviously if you don't have internet everywhere.
Only recently in the Yukon.
Right, exactly. I mean, we have a large digital divide in the US, not to mention other regions of the world. So, you know, when I talk with language programs that are trying to decide what they want to do next, it's very valuable to think about what you have at your disposal, and what is the realistic thing that you can accomplish with your community, and the best way that you can make use of those resources. So a master-apprentice approach to language revitalization, which is one elder and one person usually over the age of 18 who's working at least 10 hours a week individually with that elder to learn the language, that's a lot of resources being devoted into one learner. And that's not the right solution for every community, because it may make people feel that there's not a lot of sharing of the language, that there's only a few people that have the language. So in looking at what you're going to do, it seems to me like the video conferencing example, right? So it's not just we have a bunch of technologies or we have a bunch of curricula. It's, okay, what are we going to be able to thoughtfully accomplish? What are our goals? What do we have as our resources? And how can we parlay those into what it is we want to be doing? So sort of thoughtfulness about that.
Can I respond to that? See, there are two different scenarios. One is a language is dead or not so much in use, and somebody is trying to teach young people from that community or other communities that language in a classroom. The other scenario is there is a language which is still alive, but it is very rapidly diminishing because there are no livelihood options available, there are forced migrations, or there are laws which are against the community. Now, I am thinking of the first type of language conservation is a linguist concern, which is very good, which also should be there. But of the 7,000 languages in the world, which are likely to go down by the end of the century, as we were told this morning, thousands of them are the ones which are still around, and there between the age of 8th month to the 18th month, as Jacques Lacan will tell us, the child learns how to divide the world in terms of the self and the other within the structure of the language that the mother speaks. By the age of 3.5, the child has learned all the grammar. The school is actually redundant. When school is a tyranny that so-called civilized societies impose on children in order to make them productively useful in the society, but that's not a very fashionable view I am taking. However, it is in such societies that if livelihood possibilities are created, if respect for the language and an environment is created where respect for one's own language can be retained even after the child goes to school which teaches some other language, that is what will help the conservation of these languages. Actually, if we were to do a little percentage of languages that require conservation now, 90% are the ones which are still being spoken but may disappear. 10% might be ones which are already almost disappeared and need to be revived. So, I think these two are different scenarios. Thank you.
And then the last question that I'll present for the Secretariat, beginning with you, Jeff. So we've been talking about livelihood and respect, and some of that, right, deals with politics within groups, nations, however you want to define some political entity. So what are some of the challenges to integrating indigenous languages into national policies, strategic plans, and regulatory frameworks?
Well, all I can say is in the Middle East, recently there's been a trend toward at least blessing minority languages as opposed to active suppression of them. To a large extent, Turkey and some of the Arab countries and so forth. Beyond that, what can they do? I think it all depends on what the community that speaks a particular language wants. Some of them aren't terribly interested in developing their language. For others it's important. And then there are these cases, the trans-border languages, which are of very hot potatoes geopolitically. And so I think what they usually do is they tolerate the languages. They don't actively suppress it in the way they used to, but there's the wariness.
Would either?
Can I?
Yeah, would either of you like to also?
Yeah, about 40 years back, the world was not talking of carbon credit, but today it is. In the last 20 years, all nations have learnt that they will be measured in terms of how much carbon they put into the atmosphere and how much carbon input they can reduce. And if they do not, their offense is monetized. Language decline should be monetized. There should be a language credit. If United Nations is really serious about observing next year as Year of the Indigenous Languages, the United Nations must say to all nations that are signatory to the United Nations that if you lose any language in the next 10 years, which is recorded in your census, then you will have to pay to an imaginary, a fund they must conceptualize, which is Language Conservation Fund. If there is a major language in the world which has become threat to minor languages, then that major language ought to be paying for the conservation of minor languages. In this case, English has a very high killing rate. English has to be paying to other languages for their conservation. Only then nations will behave. Till then, if this is not monetized, nations will pay lip sympathy. I sat through a number of UN committees, UNESCO committees about languages year after year after year, and nothing gets done. They got grand dreams, but the dreams don't materialize. if all nations realize that language is a human heritage and it's our collective heritage, just as atmosphere is our collective heritage and not national property, and all nations are responsible for keeping atmosphere clean. Similarly, if all nations agree that language heritage is their collective responsibility, and if they fault on that, they better pay for it, then languages of the world have some future. Otherwise, they have no future. I mean, it's a foregone conclusion that we will be holding these seminars year after year to the end of the century. At the end of the century, out of 7,000, we will have about 300 languages left with their domains intact, and all other languages will be without their arms and legs, and they without their domains or dead in the grave. Really, I think if a recommendation has to be made to the United Nations, the recommendation must be unambiguously that language loss should be monetized as an offense by any nation.
One could also, I'm not addressing the language tax because I feel I politically can't. But one can look at where you have a lot of activity around revitalization, and there's a language economy. So on the local level, what you see are where there are jobs, where there is an incentive for learning the language, then there's this other benefit, and then people are attracted to it. And so there's, for example, Wukulkawak. This is a Guatemalan NGO that delivers healthcare in Mayan languages and ties public health to revitalization. So there's a benefit to using your language. You can get better healthcare delivery. You can look at, I mentioned Cherokee Nation's partnerships with Microsoft and Google. They have a large department of translation. So they have elders on staff who are speakers, and that's their job. Chickasaw Language Revitalization Program has a staff. So when a community decides to prioritize language, to keep it going, it's worth having some thought put into, is there a way to incentivize this? Is there a way to create a reward structure for people who are doing language work and can make contributions in a larger scale to our community? Because it will have a stronger nation. It will have a stronger, a healthier and better well-being. So that's another way you could think about it as well.
Right, so building up a language economy that can support the
Internally
efforts.
within the community, right?
But again, right, that is often the challenge, right? So you have tribal communities in the States, right, that have casinos and other sources of revenue, and they can build this, and they're good at writing grants, and they went to college. But then you have other communities, or like some of the First Nations I work with, that have no internal kind of support. And so they're completely reliant on the federal government. And so I was just reading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, which are lovely, right? And probably resonant with some of UNESCO's and the UN's statements of the previous symposia, right, where they're talking about, well, we need to create support, we need to invest, we need to appreciate, we need to respect. But at the end of the day, right, it's still being put back on communities who may or may not know exactly how to take action. And so one of these sort of all-encompassing questions that kind of cuts through a lot of these is what are the on-the-ground steps that we as scholars or linguists or language activists can take to help facilitate or guide?
Well, so I would say one of the things that I've done in my work is use service learning and partnerships with tribes. Mm-hmm. So I build relationships and do training and ask communities, what do you want? I have students, what do you want? What can we, these are the things that my students can do, these are the things that I can do. What are the things that you need? Is it possible we can match? And then the students are doing the work. So one of the projects that my students did when we first started working with the Chickasaw, hanging out, it was really hanging out with the Chickasaw. We weren't at the stage where we were working together. But there was a dictionary, a word list by Vinnie Mae Humes, and they had all these recordings that had been digitized by Sam Noble Museum. So I have a bunch of students who at various points chopped those audios into sound files, who worked with the the orthography that Ms. Humes had and did some conversions there. And recently, the Chickasaw Nation was able to put out this dictionary in a new form they call a sort of parallel format, where it had the original orthography. Also, it had the orthography developed by Pam Monroe and Catherine Willman, and it has audio that goes with it. Each of the words is there in audio. That was student labor for a chunk of that project. The students felt very good about their contributions, felt very positive about that, and we were able to find a project that fit. So I mean, I think there are a lot of people who have skills that could be put to good use, potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's open it up.
So several of the panelists earlier in the morning, and some of you also have mentioned that linguists and academics and governments don't save languages, speakers do. And I think that's important because it keeps the agency in the hands of the speakers. But I fear that it also diminishes the influence that governments and bureaucracies have. So it's not as much a specific question as asking, can you speak to that relationship of the role of speakers in preserving their language, in losing their language, and the role of governments and policymakers in contributing to the loss of language or to the preservation of language? What is the relationship between those two?
I'll start. I think governments usually get it wrong. They're thinking of uniform, standardized languages in written form. And that is increasingly irrelevant to the way what actually happens in communities. For example, they don't think much about radio. Now, there are many of the languages and so-called languages in Africa or other places where there are many different, really, you could argue they're different languages or very different varieties, and it's very hard to split the difference in a standardized written language. But you have local radio. Local radio, that's how the government communicates in effect with people in African villages, but that's never going to be part of a government policy. In Mali, for example, there's supposedly 7 languages. Well, each of those or several of those really are language families, but they can't call it that for political reasons. But on the ground, you can do things. I would if I were trying to. I'm not in a policy area, but if I were involved in an experiment on language revitalization in certain types of communities, I would focus on getting people to use it for internet, for social media. Develop an orthography that can be used in that way, and do things that involve oral, like radio or video conferencing or other things where you're using spoken language rather than a standardized script. So I think governments, and when I was saying about Morocco, the government's interested in the written formal language, and there's all this stuff going on under the radar that's gone on at street level, and that's where the real dynamics are. And so sometimes the best thing for the government to do is benign neglect. Just stay on the sidelines.
One thing that governments do often, but not always, is support public health, support community wellness, support education. So there are policy and funding vehicles that support issues that we're seeing from research. Where the language is integrated and culture is integrated, we see better outcomes for minoritized and indigenous communities. So one approach might be to think of the other funding vehicles and other ways in which language can do good in the community and to insinuate the policy and language into the policy in those policies. So a language policy can do some things, but when you talk about communities that don't have the same kinds of resources and they're dealing with food issues, I'm thinking about food deserts, they're dealing with energy issues and how they're going to have clean water. Are there ways that those kinds of programs for communities that when they're coming from the government, that language could be integrated into those? So that might be a strategy where the existing initiatives that are serving these communities, a thoughtful approach to what is out there in terms of the research that we can use to make the case that adding language to this component will allow a stronger community, a healthier community, and a more educated community that is in turn going to help fuel the economic engine of that particular country.
So in architecture, they have like the historic tax credit. So if you want to restore a historic building, you can receive a tax credit from the government to help pay or cut some of the taxes and help pay for this. Do you think that in the future that you'd ever be able to do something like that with language so that you could improve like public infrastructure, like street signs? And like, so in Ireland they have, everything is also in Gaelic, so you could also do that like on different reservations, or to have like memorials in dual language or just one language, just to improve the presentation in person.
Well, that would be a good idea, very good idea. I hope that happens, but I'm afraid it may happen slightly differently, and that is when I want to say something very nice to somebody or something very nasty to somebody, I might say, Alexa, please say the nasty or the nice thing to me, and I might pay Alexa for that. So instead of government saving our languages by providing monetary incentives, markets might gulp our languages and make them marketable commodities. Already a lot of that has happened. The market is dominating the human language behavior as never before, to the great detriment of human language stock.
Maybe this should be the last question.
I get the last question. Okay, I was thinking in the back of my mind, especially like with the Chickasaw example, with so much change that's occurred in society, and change always occurs in cultures and societies, what is, like, if we're emphasizing language, I guess this applies to any of the topics, but what's the baseline for what the authentic is? As I think about this, I think, if language and culture are kind of two sides of the same coin in some way. And I remember seeing pictures up there and I thought, well, yeah, if the foods kind of change, or even if the religion has changed, maybe some people's whole philosophical outlook. If I once lived in a kind of culture where it was a tribe that had, shamans, and they provided a certain worldview, and now half of that tribe is a certain kind of Christian religion. That would have changed a lot in that. And so if we think about restoring something or revitalizing things, what's the baseline for something that's the authentic?
So I don't sit in judgment on that question.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah.
I think so much change. What's the
what I view my role as is to facilitate the work that communities are doing for their own self-determination. So I have a set of gifts and skills thanks to my training and thanks to the people who have shared their stories with me. And if people want to do certain kind of actions and I'm able to help with that, then I do my best to help. And to kind of complete the circle of what people shared with me and what the energy that people throughout my whole career, right, where people spend time with you and you have lots of mentors and people put a lot of effort and energy and cultivation into you. And so what a community's language is, to make the comparison of what it was or how it should be, that's not my place. My place is to support what the community's goals are, and it's the communities that determine those goals. And I think that if you look, so I mentioned this paper I have in 2017 that came out in language, and the more that you think about what the community has defined as their goals, then that's what the success is. So to be able to speak, so I had a dictionary project working on this dictionary, which was for Dahana Atam, an Arizona language, and was working with some very well-regarded elders. Actually, they were too young to be elders, but middle-aged, late middle-aged. And you can recognize this language isn't the way that people used it anymore. But I certainly think we can say the same thing about Shakespeare, where it's not the language we use anymore. Language itself changes, just like a tube of lipstick. By using it, it's in a month, it's not the same thing it looked like when I opened it. So you can't step in the same river twice, right? Change is part of life.
You're touching on the issue of syncretic culture, syncretic language even, and that's another conference, but heritage communities often have something they call Spanglish or Yinglish or you name it, Glish, as an interesting syncretic language, at least for a generation or so. And then there are things happening in places like Africa where there are these new things that are bubbling up in the cities that are spreading like wildfire, and which don't fit into any traditional classification. And that's another issue for defining what indigenous language is. So it's a very big issue, kind of I guess a Pandora's box, you might say. But again, I think we're not the one. We shouldn't be, as scholars or governments, we really shouldn't be pushing people into twisting their arms to do things our way. I'm not in favor of these monetary or other ways of influencing people's behavior. In a sense, all you can really do is watch and then intervene in ways that are consistent with what's going on anyway.
I think I would also add, we've really only scratched the surface of what we know about language. And there's so many more questions to ask. Things that we may not even be able to articulate as a question right now, that in 20 years we realize, oh, that's what I was trying to get at. And the fact that we continue to, those of us who work as language scholars, language scientists, continue to find this excitement, tells us that there's so many new things out there. And sometimes our preconceived notions about what language ought to look like might change around in a decade or two, and we realize something that was in front of us all along. So I think that's one of the things I've found really exciting about the last 4 or 5 years is, wow, I thought there's so much I don't know. And I think that, we think about the situation of multilingualism in Africa, which is, it's just a very, very different situation than in the US. And these are things that we really want to be able to understand better. And hopefully people like you will be doing that as well.
All right, well, I think that's 5 minutes at least. Thank you, panelists. This was a wonderful conversation. And speaking of Africa and multilingualism, I believe in the next panel, if you stick around, we might get to talk about that some more.